The Misunderstanding of Racism: Perception, Biology, and the Limits of Human Vision. Introduction. In contemporary discussions, quote-unquote, racism is often used as a broad label for a variety of behaviors and attitudes, from explicit hatred to unconscious bias to just hate oriented to certain people for no specific or clear reason. However, not every action that appears racist stems from a belief in racial superiority or prejudice. Much of what we perceive as racism today may instead arise from ordinary human perceptual and social mechanisms. This essay proposes that true racism, the belief in biological hierarchies among human races, is distinct from other, more instinctive or perceptual phenomena that are often mistaken for racism. Understanding these distinctions can help us respond more intelligently to human differences and foster genuine connection rather than reinforcing division. 1. True racism, the ideology of biological differences. The first and most fundamental form of racism is the belief that humanity is divided into distinct biological races with fixed and unequal capacities. This ideology, often termed scientific racism, dominated European thought from the 18th century through the early 20th century. Thinkers such as John Friedrich Blumenbach, who classified 5 quote-unquote races of men in the late 1700s, and later pseudoscientists like Arthur Gobineau and Madison Grant promoted the idea that Europeans were inherently more intelligent, moral, or quote-unquote civilized than Africans or Asians. Modern science, however, has decisively disproven this. Beginning in the mid-20th century, genetics demonstrated that the genetic variation among human populations is continuous rather than discrete. In 1972, the population geneticist Richard Lewontin published a seminal paper showing that about 85% of genetic variation occurs within any given population and only about 15% between populations. This means that two people from the same so-called quote-unquote race may be as genetically different as two people from different quote-unquote races. Subsequent research, including work by Luigi Luca Cavalli Sforza, Craig Venter, and the Human Genome Project, 2003, confirmed that the concept of biological race has no genetic basis. Humans are a single, highly interrelated species with minor superficial differences in skin pigmentation, hair texture, and facial features. Thus, true racism, the belief in inherent racial hierarchies, is a relic of ignorance and convenience. It once served to justify colonialism, slavery, and social stratification, but it has no scientific foundation. Those who still cling to this belief today do so in defiance of overwhelming biological evidence. 2. Prejudice and correlation. The cognitive bias form. A second kind of behavior, often labeled as racism, stems not from ideology but from cognitive shortcuts. Humans naturally look for patterns and infer causation from correlation. When we see two things occur together, such as poverty and dark skin in some regions, we may unconsciously link them, assuming one causes the other. This type of prejudice, though not grounded in a belief in racial inferiority, still produces discriminatory outcomes. Psychological research supports this idea. Cognitive scientists like Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky showed how humans rely on heuristics, mental shortcuts that simplify decision-making but can lead to systematic errors. These heuristics underpin implicit bias, a concept studied extensively by Mazarin Banaji and Anthony Greenwald. Their implicit association test, IAT for short, revealed that many people, unconsciously associate certain skin color with negative or positive traits, even if they explicitly reject racist beliefs. This type of prejudice operates at the level of perception and pattern recognition, not ideology. It arises from the way our brains categorize the world, a deeply human tendency that can be corrected only through awareness and education. 3. Perceptual racism, light visibility, and the human eye. A third phenomenon, which may look like racism but is not, emerges from the simple physics of light and human visual perception. Our eyes perceive objects through reflected light. Lighter surfaces reflect more light, darker ones absorb more. This means that in dim lighting conditions, lighter objects, or lighter skin, are more visible. This is not a matter of social bias, but of optical physics. Scientific evidence supports this. Human eyes are more sensitive to contrasts in luminance, lightness, than to differences in hue or saturation. The Weber-Fechner law in psychophysics describes how our ability to detect differences in brightness depends on relative contrast. We notice lighter surfaces more easily than darker ones. In other words, lighter tones, quote unquote, stand out more because they reflect more photons in the eye. This principle is purely physical. In a dark room, a light-skinned person reflects more light and is more visible than a dark-skinned person. Similarly, artworks or photographs often draw the viewer's gaze towards the brightest regions first, a phenomenon known in visual psychology as the salience of luminance. When applied socially, this perceptual bias can have subtle consequences. In environments where lighter-skinned individuals are the majority, darker faces may literally attract less visual attention, not out of prejudice but due to sensory contrast. However, when this perceptual bias interacts with cultural unfamiliarity or social hierarchy, it can contribute to feelings of invisibility or exclusion. Recognizing this mechanism helps us design fairer and more inclusive environments, for example in photography, workplace lighting, or media representation. 4. The familiarity principle, stranger danger, and social bias. Beyond vision, humans are evolutionarily predisposed to prefer the familiar. Anthropologists and psychologists have long observed that humans evolved in small, kin-based groups where strangers often posed a threat. This instinct persists today in what we might call the quote-unquote stranger danger reflex. We feel more at ease with people who look, sound, and behave like those in our familiar group. This phenomenon has been documented as the in-group bias in social psychology. Henry Teifel's social identity theory of 1979 demonstrated that people form in-groups and out-groups even when the distinctions are arbitrary, such as the color of a shirt or a random team assignment. Similarly, studies by Robert Kurzban and John Tooby in evolutionary psychology show that humans categorize others by coalitional cues, who is quote-unquote us and who is quote-unquote them, as a survival strategy. Thus, our tendency to be more sympathetic to those like us is not uniquely European, Western, or modern. It's a universal human trait. The Dutch saying, wat de boer niet kent, dat vreet hij niet, what the farmer doesn't know, he won't eat, captures this deep-seated instinct for familiarity. The challenge of modern multicultural societies is to consciously overcome this instinct, not by denying it, but by broadening the scope of who we consider us. 5. The paradox of anti-racism, when awareness reinforces division. If we accept that many apparent forms of racism are rooted in perception and instinct rather than ideology, then constantly reinforcing the idea of fixed racial categories may backfire. Or actually, they do backfire, as we have seen in the last few years. When we teach that one group is inherently an quote unquote oppressor and another group an quote unquote oppressed, we risk re-inscribing that very division we aim to dismantle. Instead of seeing each other as individuals, we begin to see ourselves as representatives of racial blocs. In this way, the discourse of race can unintentionally revive the old biological model it sought to reject. A white, quote unquote, person taught to see himself as inherently privileged and a quote unquote black person taught to see herself as inherently oppressed both come to see race as a primary identity, and this perception obstructs genuine human connection. As long as the mental category of quote unquote race stands between individuals, mutual understanding remains difficult. The solution then is not to deny differences but to rehumanize it. We must meet one another as persons, not as symbols of racial history, and consciously build familiarity where instincts once built distance. Conclusion. Racism, in its original and truest form, is a false ideology, the belief in biological hierarchies among humans. This belief has been thoroughly disproven by modern genetics and anthropology. What remains are perceptual and social tendencies, biases rooted in how our eyes and brains evolved to process the world. We see lighter things more easily than darker ones. We feel safer with the familiar than with the strange. These are not moral failings, but aspects of human nature that demand awareness and compensation. The path forward lies not in perpetuating racial categories or guilt, but in cultivating proximity, understanding, and shared experience. When people know each other as individuals, the primitive instincts of unfamiliarity fade. Racism, or what remains of it, can be overcome not by accusation, but by human connection.